Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the mind-brain interface. With me is Professor Marjorie Woollacott, emeritus professor of Neuroscience and Human Physiology at the University of Oregon. She is also the co-author of a textbook, Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice, and also her newest book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. Welcome again, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. You've gone through an enormous transformation from a materialistic neuroscientist to someone who is endeavoring to integrate some of the most exotic yoga philosophies from Kashmir Shaivism into a scientific model of how the brain actually works and how consciousness could possibly interface with the brain. It's a mystery that has puzzled philosophers and scientists, I think, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I'm under the impression from reading your recent book that actually a lot of progress has been made.
I agree, and I am really impressed, first of all, that though many neuroscientists, in fact, the majority of neuroscientists still are under that materialist worldview that we might say, that basically we simply have a brain and neurons that somehow create our thoughts. And we have an illusion of a self that's in there that's actually governing and controlling things with its own free will. That's not true. That may still be the major worldview of neuroscientists, but there are more and more people, whether they're neuroscientists or physicists, mathematicians, philosophers, that are saying, wait a minute, that doesn't really explain all of the data and we need to have something else. And so one of the things that I like to point out is that when you talk to the average neuroscientist, they really believe that your brain, when it gathers in all of the sensory information and binds it into one particular whole, is really the controller of every single one of our thoughts. And they call this sort of what I might call a one-way interaction between brain and mind. It's our brain that is productive of our mental activity. And now there are other people that are beginning to say, wait a minute, there are other possible models that are equally effective in explaining our behaviors. And maybe I'll start just with one of those particular models, again, put forth by Roger Sperry, who was a Nobel Prize-winning scientist and a neuroscientist. So I want to say that, again, these are not just people out there with no credentials. This was a Nobel Prize winner. And what Roger Sperry said is, he said, when you look at the materialist perspective, it can't really explain how our mind appears to truly influence the activity of our brain and our body.
Which is the common sense experience, I'm sure, of all of our viewers.
Exactly, right. We all believe that our mind is controlling our actions. And what Sperry said is that it appears that there is a way of looking at this that he calls emergent interactionism. And when he says that word, emergent interactionism, what he really means is that when you look at the increasing complexity of brains over evolution, over time, you find that when we have this very complex brain structure that we have right now as human beings and other higher animals, that the simple laws of the simple neuron and the simple neurotransmitters, et cetera, don't necessarily apply anymore. And now, within these complex entities of the brain, these complex structures, you have new laws that are actually governing. And these new laws, he says, are that, for example, our thoughts that come into our brain can actually influence our body, and also the thoughts of other people can influence our thoughts and influence our body. So it's a whole new way of thinking that is not just bottom up, which would be the traditional materialist worldview, but includes now a top-down mind to brain and to body interaction.
In other words, if I understand his thinking, it's that the brain produces consciousness, and then consciousness takes on certain powers of its own to influence the brain in return.
Exactly. And so he gives the example that for the way a neuroscientist might view a particular action is that it's more of a stimulus response type of thing. So something in the environment stimulates me to think, I'm hungry, and therefore I'll go ahead and go off to the refrigerator and get something to eat. So stimulus response. And he's saying, no, there's something much more than that. That may be a part of our nervous system physiology, but he says, in addition, if you decide that you hear that, in fact, by eating the wrong foods, for example, and too much of them, you can become obese, and that can really affect your health. You might make a decision at the mental level that you are not going to start eating any more chocolate eclairs or ice cream or things like that. You're going to begin to eat much more healthy foods. And he says that would be what he would call the top-down interaction, that your mind has made a decision about its own health and well-being that now influences your choices and the way you then live.
So one might say the stimulus response model is still there, but there's an intermediary function of mental processing.
Right, exactly. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. And I think that many neuroscientists are very happy with that one because it seems to at least keep consciousness within the mind and the body together.
It doesn't really challenge their paradigm too much.
It doesn't challenge it too much, exactly.
Yeah.
But then when you see other people coming along, and now I would go to Sir John Eccles, again, another Nobel Prize winner for anybody that is wondering about his credentials, and an incredibly capable neuroscientist. He is one of the people that actually studied the synaptic junction between one neuron and another and showed how chemicals are actually released at the synapse from one neuron that then affect another neuron and make it be active.
I met him in 1976.
Wow.
He was the keynote speaker for the Parapsychology Association convention that year.
Wow. So this is an amazing thing that he would actually be in the mainstream of neuroscience like myself, but also be willing to talk at a Parapsychology Association because he has ideas that really work with both.
Yes, indeed.
So one of the things that I realize he is saying, wait a minute, the materialist perspective doesn't work. Let's expand it. And he really talks about what he would call dualism. And by dualism, he simply means that our consciousness, our mind, is separate from our body, but it can have a strong effect on our body. And here he brings in, like other people after him, including Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist, quantum physics. And what he's saying here is that when you go down to look at the synapse, and the membrane channels within the synapse of a neuron, you're getting down to like 10 to the minus 9th meters, which is like a nanometer. And now you're at the area of space where quantum physics can actually be effective.
So there could be quantum physical effects at the synapses.
Exactly.
And quantum physical effects are very strange. They're not like what we normally experience in the macro world. An electron could jump from here to here without going through the intervening space.
Exactly. So now you're dealing with something that's no longer Newtonian physics, and you're dealing with a place where now you could imagine that consciousness, the mind of the observer, could actually affect the outcome, in this case, of the brain. And so what he does is talk about how it could be related actually to transmitter release at the synapse. And then right after Eccles came Henry Stapp, working in the same particular area, this quantum physicist from the University of California at Berkeley. And he says, actually, let's take it a little further and let's imagine that when an action potential goes to the end of a neuron, to its synapse, what happens is that it actually allows its membrane channels to open and calcium, which is actually in the synaptic cleft between neurons, to go inside of the neuron in these tiny, tiny channels, where you have quantum effects, and they can release more or less neurotransmitter depending on the intention of the observer, which is we ourselves, our own mind. And so he's saying that this is the way that mind can affect the body and the brain.
Because in quantum physics, the role of the observer is part of the equations, part of the process, unlike classical physics.
Exactly. And what I want to say then is that what Stapp does, and I'm sure that Eccles was thinking along these lines himself, is that when you really look at quantum physics, and for example, Van Neumann's ideas of quantum physics, he says that the observer is essential to understanding the outcome of any experiment. And he says that one of the things the observer does is he chooses what question to ask.
Yes.
In terms of what experiment he's going to do. And that also affects the answer he's going to get. And the other thing he says is that we have to remember in quantum physics that everything is out there in what you might call a probability cloud of potentialities before the observer decides to ask a particular question. And when he asks that particular question at that point, and he does the experiment, the probability cloud of infinite potentialities actually goes down, contracts into one particular point of an answer to that question.
Now, I understand that one of the critiques of this way of thinking is that really in order to modify human behavior and even human thought patterns, it's not enough simply to have conscious control over a single synapse or even a single neuron. There needs to be coordinated effects over bundles of neurons.
Exactly. And I think the point is that when you're dealing with the conscious observer, you're dealing with a strong intention that can affect many, many neurons throughout your body simultaneously. And I think that that's one of the keys. I think one of the things that Stapp says related to von Neumann's ideas is that what you are doing is that you are creating what we would call a very strong intention in your own consciousness. And attention, meaning that you're focusing down into one particular area that you want to become reality. And he says, when you do this over a period of time where you are thinking the same thought again and again and again over and over again, that allows this transfer into your neurophysiology of your synaptic transmitters, et cetera, to actually create an outcome within your own body.
And this model might well still be consistent then with the materialistic bottom-up approach.
Well, I don't know exactly how you would get there, because if you really believe it's a stimulus response phenomenon, it would have to be a stimulus from outside that is actually doing this. Now, you could imagine that if you watched enough TV commercials about the greatness of, say, Twinkies or something like that, you might eventually over time change your habits and be then eating many more Twinkies. So that would be a stimulus response from outside. But I think what Eccles is saying, what Stapp is saying, what, in fact, Roger Sperry is saying, is that we're saying that the mind, which is consciousness, is actually itself affecting the neurons themselves.
Well, now, back to our previous discussion of Sperry, it sounded like he was still what we'd call an epiphenomenalist, that the brain produces the mind, and then the mind, having been produced by the brain, has a mind of its own.
Exactly. He's only going that far instead of saying it's actually separate.
But Eccles seems to be, as a dualist, is saying there is a realm of consciousness completely independent of the physical body. And at that point, we begin to see the brain not so much as the manufacturer of consciousness, like the philosopher John Searle would say, the brain produces consciousness like the stomach produces digestion.
Yes.
But Eccles and others who are dualists would say maybe the brain is the receiver of consciousness, like a radio receiver.
Exactly. And I think that is a beautiful analogy that has been used way back from the time of people in the 1800s, for example, William James. That was a beautiful analogy that I think still holds very well, that perhaps you have this non-local consciousness and the brain is receiving information from that non-local consciousness, which could be, again, your own mind, but perhaps other people's minds as well in the universe. And you receive that creative information. It comes into your local consciousness of your mind and then down to affect your brain.
So the brain acts as a filter.
Definitely. And what's interesting to me is here, in fact, what you were just saying is that many materialists might also understand the idea of filtering. That's absolutely the case. And when I was a young graduate student and we were talking about how it is that we have this incredible amount of information flooding our senses, visual information, auditory information, etc., how is it that I only really see you and I don't see all the other things that are coming in, flooding my senses? And the point is that they believe our nervous system has to filter this information for us to be able to make sense of our universe. And for me to be really talking to you in a very coherent way without letting all this other stuff distract me.
Well, you've pointed out in previous interviews the experience of non-local awareness, which is like infinite, that you have a sense I gather you might feel like experiencing the whole universe at one moment.
That is true. And I think we hear that from great sages of various traditions, that they have had this experience. I think that they also say that simultaneously they can be functioning at the local level, interacting in their filtered way with the people around them very effectively. In fact, I've heard some of the people who talk about these sages say that they typically are not in a thinking mode when they don't need to be, but then they go right back into their more local contracted consciousness when they need to be, of having that filtered awareness.
In other words, while this contracted consciousness seems to be pretty useful for driving your car, tying your shoelaces, and all the things that we have to do in the physical world, the brain might be capable of much more than that.
Exactly. And I think that what they're actually saying is that when we quiet our thoughts down, which are, in a certain sense, our filters so that keep us from seeing very many things, it's when the thoughts are minimal that we can actually expand and experience much more creativity, much more information from perhaps a non-local realm that actually can improve the outcome of whatever we're thinking about or planning.
So now we've just discussed a couple of Nobel scientists who are talking about the causal role of mind or consciousness.
Right.
As a neuroscientist yourself, is there any reason based on the data of neuroscience to object to that worldview?
And absolutely there is. And that's the neuroscientists, I think, tend to look at what they have found so far in neuroscience. And I should say, again, when I was a young graduate student, I read all of these studies that showed that when you actually have an injury to the brain, you lose particular functions. And I talk in my book about different aspects of that. One particular man who had a stroke, and in the stroke to one part of his brain, he lost his ability to even be aware of objects on the opposite side of his body because of that stroke. So he lost all attentional awareness. And in fact, the only way that he could eat in the morning and eat all of the food on his plate was for his wife to rotate the plate around after he'd eaten the food, just for example, on the right side of the plate. And when he was an artist, and when he would actually do paintings after the stroke, he was only painting one particular part of the canvas because he couldn't even be aware of the other particular part of the canvas. So the neuroscientists say, hey, look at this. This means that our brain produces our attentional awareness, our consciousness, our reality. And of course, other neuroscientists have shown examples of people that have a lesion in their parietal lobe, which is the area where we bind information together in our brain. And they say when a person has a tumor that grows there, they can no longer see the entire picture in front of them, for example, you in front of me as one whole, but they only see, for example, your eyes or your nose or your ears, and they're always having their eyes dash from one place to another, trying to figure out how it goes together. So they say, clearly, it's your brain that's producing the binding of your whole awareness together.
So we must have, at this point, a lot of data regarding injuries to the brain and how that affects behavior and awareness.
Right. And I think the beautiful thing that the people who are saying, wait a minute, their brain is a receiver and or a transmitter are saying is that actually that analogy may be true in a certain sense, and that if you break the brain, you're no longer going to be able to receive the information from outside or transmit it. But just like radios and televisions, that doesn't mean there isn't something that you are actually receiving. It doesn't mean that all of that information is inside the television or the radio. It just means that the receiving mechanism is broken. And so I think that's where the neuroscientist's analogy doesn't really work so well. They have to really look beyond just being a producer of this activity inside the brain.
Well, the tricky thing I would imagine from the point of view of materialist science, I know a quantum physicist who's also a parapsychologist, and he says, well, if you're a dualist, you still have the problem of how the mind and brain interface, because he says, take a look at a neutrino. It is a real physical particle, but it can pass through the earth without any interactions at all. So if the mind is totally non-physical, there's no way it could influence a physical system.
You're right. And I think that that's the interesting point where we then move on to what I might call a philosophy that would be a non-dual philosophy that actually includes consciousness within every aspect of the universe. And I think I was mentioning earlier that, in fact, when you talk about Kashmir Shaivism, you're talking about this consciousness that is non-local contracting down into every aspect of reality, and then that consciousness remaining in every particle of the universe. So in this case, you now have a non-dualism that includes consciousness within it. And I think that, in fact, David Chalmers, who is a philosopher and a mathematician, is one that began putting forward this new understanding in many, many consciousness conferences in the last 20, 25 years.
In other words, you're saying that you're not a dualist, you're not a materialist, you're something else, a panpsychist.
Yes, you could call it a panpsychist. And I realize when people use that term, they use it in different ways. And I want to be clear that when I talk about panpsychism, I would be talking about what I might call an idealist panpsychism. And what I mean by that is that the mind is actually creating material reality. And as it does, as consciousness creates material reality, consciousness goes into it. It's not like consciousness is out there at a very, very low level, and the more complex material reality is, the more conscious it is. But literally that it is a top-down creation of reality, not a bottom-up.
And this would be based on some of the philosophy you've studied from Kashmir Shaivism.
It is. And in fact, in addition to that philosophy, I think more and more philosophers from Western philosophy are saying exactly the same thing. And one of the examples I like to think about is Christoph Koch, who was a neuroscientist just like myself and a materialist for many, many years. And when I would go to these Towards the Science of Consciousness conferences in the past, it would be Christoph Koch that would be standing there saying what I would call promissory materialism in terms of his perspective, which was eventually we're going to solve this brain-mind interface problem, and we're going to show how neurons create consciousness.
Materialist science has built the atomic bomb. Surely we can solve the problem of consciousness.
Exactly.
If you just give us enough time.
Exactly. And I think what was beautiful is he was collaborating with Francis Crick, another Nobel Prize winner, and they were both sure this was going to happen. And at some particular point, Christoph Koch mentions he had sort of an epiphany that no matter how many neurons he could sample and how he could correlate the activity of neurons with conscious awareness, he's simply only looking at really a collaborative process between neurons and the brain. He was looking at just explaining how they might compare to what we're seeing in the brain, but he wasn't showing a causal relationship between neurons and the production of consciousness. And he suddenly said, I really need to shift my whole worldview. And that's when he began to say, I truly believe that consciousness does exist within every aspect of the universe, in every particle of the universe.
Down to electrons.
Down to electrons, yes.
Other quarks, perhaps.
Yes. And now when you read his articles, he's really trying to create this new worldview that would include consciousness within material reality as a part of it.
Which is really quite consistent with Asian philosophies.
Exactly, right.
Well, that's really quite a story. I know there are still many pieces of the puzzle that need to be reconfigured, but it sounds to me as if what you're describing is quite consistent with the viewpoint of every scientist I've ever talked to who has seriously grappled with these issues.
I agree. And I think that what we can see is that there's a whole continuum as people have developed from Roger Sperry's Emergent interactionism through perhaps Eccles looking at dualism, but then to others. For example, David Bohm, who we haven't even talked about.
Oh, yes.
Another quantum physicist that said, hey, wait a minute. You have to consider the universe as a whole, and you have to consider that, in fact, everything within the universe is connected to everything else. And you cannot talk about dualism. You really need to talk about this monistic, if we want to call it, philosophy that includes everything being connected to everything else and having an effect on everything else in the universe.
William James put it over 100 years ago that the very idea that there's an inside and an outside is something of an illusion, that they're two different realms. There's one realm. It may appear to be subjective at times or objective at times, but it's all the same.
Right. And I think of what I love about David Bohm as well is that he talks about this implicit order, meaning that if you look at the surface of things, you see things that may appear to be disconnected in terms of not understanding how one might be actually influencing another. But when you look at this implicit order, which he calls like an enfolded order of the universe, you begin to see how something in the past might actually be affecting the outcome of something today. Or something at a distance, like an electron at a distance may be affecting the activity of an electron close to us us because they are connected at one level or another. And that, to me, also explains these ancient ideas of like karma, the law of cause and effect, where, for example, it's clear with cause and effect that if I drop a crystal glass, it's going to break instantly on the floor if the floor is hard enough, but it doesn't necessarily explain, unless you really understand the implicate order, the unfolding of things, how something I did 20 or 30 years ago can affect something that is an outcome now. And I think when you think about it, we see that all the time with, for example, pollutants in our environment, and the fact that that can affect our getting cancer 20 years down the line, or if I'm a smoker, that might allow me to get cancer. And at the moment, I don't see any relationship to that while I'm smoking that first cigarette, but the cumulative effects create what I might call a karmic influence.
So the idea of the implicate order, as described by David Bohm, is that in every action or every moment, there are hidden possibilities waiting to be realized.
Exactly. And in every action, there are hidden possibilities from the past that are influencing that as well. And they cover the entire cosmos. They cover my interaction with so many people that I've interacted with in the past and I've even forgotten about now, but they still have an influence on me and the outcomes of what I do.
Well, it suggests that as you begin to look at this more deeply, some of our conventional ideas about objective, subjective, space and time need to be revised.
They do. And to me also, they remind us that since intention is so important, that we as aspects of what we might call this consciousness itself that is all powerful can in fact create the results that we really want by simply focusing very strongly on a particular intention for our lives. And it empowers us greatly as human beings in that way.
Well, William James, who was a real pioneer in this area, was thinking 100 years perhaps ahead of his time, was a very sickly and depressed man, and he discovered that he could cure himself of his depression by changing the way he thought.
Yes. So scientists knew this, more than 100 years ago, and we sort of forgot it during our time in the early 1900s when we went into our stimulus response mode of really looking at science and the brain. And now I think in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and until now, people are beginning to rise out of that as scientists and saying, wait a minute, we need to go back and really think about what William James was really saying in the late 1800s.
So in other words, to sum things up, when we talk about the mind-brain interface, we can't simply think about it mechanistically. It's much more than a mechanism.
It is, right. There is this whole level of consciousness that we have to actually acknowledge exists, and then acknowledging it, we can harness it for the benefit of ourselves and other people.
Professor Marjorie Woollacott, what a fascinating discussion. Yet again, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.